Hey y'all, it's your girl, Dr. Makeba, host of the Healthy Woman Podcast, a talk therapy platform curating healthy conversations so that women like you can serve God while also pursuing an optimal state of holistic health. Hey y'all, welcome to the Healthy Woman Podcast. It's your girl, Dr. Makeba. I am your host for today. We are at episode number 4, y'all. Can you believe it? We are here. Now, if you are a stranger to the Healthy Woman Podcast, or for whatever reason, you just happened to scroll by or you saw the logo or something, or maybe somebody shared this podcast episode or a podcast episode with you, and it's your first time listening to us, I want to say welcome and let you know that you are no longer a stranger. You are a part of the Healthy Woman family. So welcome. And if you are an original gangster listener, I call you an OG listener. That means that you know me from a social platform, or we have history together, or you know me personally, or whatever. And you listen to content that I put out, or you have listened to this podcast from the beginning. Thank you for being here. I thank you so much for your loyalty. Thank you so much for your commitment to wanting to see this platform grow to beyond anything that we can ever imagine. So thank you so much. Remember, all I need you to do is share this podcast or any podcast episode out to one additional girlfriend, and that alone will allow our impact to double and will allow us to be able to reach more people with just the click of a share. So again, thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to have you here. Today is another wonderful episode, phenomenal episode. And I have brought one of my favorite guests here to talk. But before I introduce you to her, one of the things that we are going to talk about today, well, I say one of the things, but I would probably say a few things that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about church and therapy. So if you know about me, you know that I'm a church girl. Always have been, always will be, from now until forever. I'm a church girl. And but I did not start going to therapy until I would say maybe 3 years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I started going to therapy and started really taking therapy seriously. And it wasn't necessarily because I didn't believe in therapy, but it might have slightly, you'll only hear me say it here. It's probably because I didn't feel like I could benefit from therapy. I didn't feel like I could get anything out of therapy. Like, what could therapy do for me? Because in the African American culture, it's getting a little bit more tolerant now, but in past before, and I've watched a lot of television shows where the running joke is, you don't go to therapy, girl, you go to church. Black people don't go to therapy, Black people go to church, right? And so I think that I kind of maybe fell into that sometime when it came to really navigating my way through my emotional thoughts and through my mental thoughts. And then also, tag on top of that, the traumatic experiences that I've had that you may know a little bit about, but not in totality. We'll talk about that throughout the parts of this podcast, because as I've always mentioned before, this podcast is a journey of my personal life. I did not put this podcast together per se to put everybody else out there. This literally was an answer to prayer from God and kind of an assignment and an order from God for me to edify women in preparation for purpose, but in order for them to fulfill purpose in a effective and more positive way, they had to be able to navigate the various experiences of their life from a holistic health perspective. And that all came from me. All of the physical health journeys I've been through, the emotional health journeys, the mental health journeys, psychological, all that other stuff that I've mentioned so liberally before, that's where the podcast came from. And so when it comes to therapy and being a church girl, like I mentioned earlier, it's becoming a little bit more tolerant because I would say in some spaces, therapy is kind of trendy, where you hear a lot of people talking about therapy. And so you might find yourself being inquisitive about what therapy looks like and what therapy can do for me, and how do I find a therapist, or how do I look for a therapist that's going to be appropriate for me. So we're going to dive into that a little bit today. We're going to talk about that. I have an amazing mental health therapist. She's, I would imagine, a therapist from just different walks of life. And she can talk to you from a number of different angles. But we're also going to talk about Black women in general, right? Their trauma and the success link. I talked about that in a previous podcast episode with some of my other girlfriends, and what that trauma and the success link and where it comes from, and if it's even something that's viable. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to get into like marriage and divorce. You guys know my story. I'm a divorcee who is actually married again. Praise God. There is hope on the other side. There is hope on the other side. You can actually go through a divorce and get married again. So, but we're going to talk a little bit about that. So without further ado, I am going to introduce my guest today, whom I met when I moved to Chicago. I met her probably a little less than a year after I moved to Chicago, in a more kind of professional church space. We knew each other. We've kind of had like not a close friendship, but we've had a friendship nonetheless, from a distance. And so I definitely honor her, and I acknowledge the expertise that she has in the space of mental health. And so, excuse me, Kesha Hammond, TeraKesha Hammond.
That's what my mama called me.
All right. We don't call you what your mama call you until you tell me otherwise. Miss TeraKesha Hammond, getting ready to be Dr. TeraKesha Hammond, but I won't put that title on you right now, because I know it takes a little bit of work to get that title.
Yes, it does.
All right, but Miss TeraKesha Hammond, Kesha Hammond, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And I loved your story. I've always loved your story.
Girl, this story is some child. This story. And I love telling my story.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. I love telling my story. I did not always like telling my story because I was ashamed of my story. But it wasn't until God gave me the release to write my book, after I moved to Chicago, where he was like, I want you to be open, be transparent. There was a time when I wasn't transparent, and now I just tell everything. And sometimes people don't like when I tell everything. They're like, you're talking a little bit too much. I'm like, well, you don't understand. I have to, because I'm called to somebody, and somebody gets something out of what I say. So I appreciate that. So before we get started, this is going to be a very rich conversation. All of my conversations be rich, girl.
I know.
I got the gift of gab, and the Lord is blessing me with this mouth. So, Kesha, rapid fire, coffee or tea?
Coffee all day.
All day. Beach or mountains?
Beach.
Me too, girl. Me too.
Yes. I'm gonna get black.
Yes.
Beach and glistening.
Ooh, that beach. Something about that beach. Now, I'm not gonna be in the water all the time, but it's something about the beach. Yeah. Last one, books or movies?
A book.
Can you recommend a good book for our listeners?
Ooh, a good book for listeners. You know, there's a couple, but one is is Self-Care for the Black Woman. That's a good one.
Okay.
For the church folks, right now I'm reading, and it's a school, but it's a really good book called God, Marriage, and Family.
Okay. So Self-Care for the Black Woman.
Yes.
And then God, Marriage, and Family. I'm going to have to put both of those on my book list.
Yeah. And then I love a good Peter Scazzero, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. Okay. You said book one, but.
No, so I've heard about that. I actually have one of his from IPM. And I have in my Amazon cart like a few more because they were recommended. So if you didn't hear her, she said Pete Scazzero, who is the author of a number of different emotionally healthy books. He has a number of different ones. So you might want to check out that. Very good reading too, not difficult reading for you. So thank you for that. All right, so Kesha, let's start. Who is Kesha Hammond?
When people ask that question, I never know where to start.
It's so loaded.
So let me see. I'm a therapist, as you said. I'm a mental health therapist. I'm a country girl from Kentucky. I moved to Chicago almost 30 years ago. green. I mean, so green behind the ears. And I was just like, what's going on when I moved to Chicago? My mother said Chicago changed me. But what she didn't recognize is when I left her house, I was a young girl, you know. So when I came to Chicago, I had to move into adulthood. So I had to make some changes. And so she had to get used to having an adult daughter. And
because
so
when you left, you weren't an adult daughter.
No, I was 18 and I went to college and went on, and then I never went back home except for like summer break. So I think who I am, I think has to go back a little bit back to conception, right? So single mom, knew my father, but my father denied me for 9 months. Mom was a virgin when she got pregnant with me, first time ever. When she realized I wasn't going anywhere, because she tried, she prayed a prayer every day of her pregnancy that said something like, God, let people like her, let her have favor. Now, my mother wasn't saved. She knew of God, but she didn't really have a relationship. Let her be jet black and ugly. I don't care, as long as she's healthy. These are the kind of this is the prayer that my mother prayed. Dang, mama. Good G, you know.
Dang, mama.
And so when she, as she prayed that prayer, so I grew up, playing sports, cheerleader, those types of things. But I think that's important because her prayer stayed with me throughout life. I went to a high school, 10% Black people. And out of my senior class, I was chosen as the leader of my class, which was unknown, right? Here's this Black young girl being chosen by her classmates, mostly white, as the leader of the class. So God always showed me that was my mother's prayer following me. So I went to college, came to Chicago, always in the public health field. But then got wanted to do more mental health. Then went to back to school, and got a degree in mental health clinical counseling. After that, I'm unmarried. I'm divorced. I'm a divorcee too. Woo 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 woo. It's been 11 years. I cannot believe it.
So when did you get divorced?
2013.
Okay, so I got divorced 2011. So when you said almost, it's pretty close.
Yeah, pretty close.
I got divorced. My divorce was final in 2012.
Yep.
2011.
It's been 11 years. I have no children. Okay. My mother and father had children once I was 18. So I grew up as an only child. And then now I have siblings that I'm old enough to be their mother. Okay. So those are my relation, they give me that nurtured relationship that I always wanted to have with children. Well, I don't necessarily what I always want to have with children, but what I thought I would have with children.
Right. Okay. Okay.
And so that's just a little about who I am. I am in ministry. It's a loaded question.
It is a loaded question, and we'll probably unpack it more as we talk. But as you were speaking, I hear some more things that are actually going to allow me to be a little bit more loaded as we continue, because I'm a teacher by trade, and I like to just ask people loaded stuff. And I just like to ask stuff. I know when I sent you the talking tips and the questions, I know you was like, child,
there is Dr. Makeba.
A whole lot of stuff. Because when I train, this is another little known fact about me. When I train people, in my job, when I train, I always tell people I prefer that you leave overwhelmed than underwhelmed.
Yes,
because I do not want you to leave my space having said this was a complete waste of my time. I would rather you leave my space and be like, oh, that was a lot of information. Let me figure out how I can navigate my way through it. So it's kind of the same thing here. I want us to be able to have a jam-packed hour-long or hour-plus-long session of really meaningful conversation. So that's where that comes from. So let's dive in. So what I always like to say is please be as transparent as you are comfortable with being, because I don't want to overstep any boundary. So let's talk about marriage and let's talk about divorce. Because those are one of the things. So as I've heard already, you and I have two very powerful pieces in common: marriage, divorce, and no children. And all of them kind of fit together right? So I would like to talk about that a little bit right now. I had this conversation in another episode, and I kind of want to see what your thoughts on it as we move forward. But let's first talk about marriage. So you got married when?
I was 31.
Okay, so after you moved, your ex-husband was from Chicago?
Yes.
Okay, so tell me about that. Like, how was the marriage, and what happened with it? Why are you not married today?
Ooh, loaded question again.
It is loaded. That's a loaded question.
So let's see. Met my ex-husband in church. Okay. Was totally not interested. He was a musician. My girlfriend said, "Did you see the church musician, the new church musician?"
Girl, what he played?
Not the organ.
Oh, I was about to say.
The organ. So I said, no, I did not see him, and I'm not interested. Of course I saw him.
Right.
But I'm like, I'm not interested. I don't really date musicians or whatever. So from there, I was wooed. And so it's interesting how my marriage story comes about, because I was one of those women. I always wanted to go to college. It was like, if marriage and children come, it comes. If it doesn't, it doesn't. My other friends were like, "Oh, I'm gonna get married and have 5 kids. I'm gonna do this." I was like, no. If it happens, it happens. And so with marriage, I was not ready for marriage, because of just me and where I was emotionally. Coming to Chicago in the big city, again, I said earlier, I was green. Like, I did not understand the culture. I had to come to Chicago and learn a whole new culture in the Black community that I wasn't familiar with, culture in the Black church that I wasn't familiar with. And so when I got there, I'm wooed by this person that I thought I could trust, right? So speed up a little bit. Even a couple of months, Makeba, it was like the Holy Spirit was like, before I was supposed to get married, was like, something's not right. But there was so much like smoke and fog and not understanding like what's really going on. And then people just not really just telling like the truth, right? And so what I ended up doing was like, I gave him his ring back and was like, we're not supposed to be getting married, or we should either wait. And I used to say I fell for the okie doke. But what I actually did was, I loved him. There was a love that I had developed for him, but I was not at the place where I could emotionally make a sound decision, because of just not of my own, but just other things that were just kind of in place. And so again, he was like, "Oh, I love you. I'm going to make some changes. I'm going to do this. And I chalked it up as just maturity. He's like 4 years younger than me. And so as we went through the marriage, the mask came off. Now here I was being as genuine and authentic as I thought I could be, but then the mask comes off. And then I'm seeing things like, but still not wondering, like, is this what I'm seeing, or is this what's going on? Just confusion and lack of judgment and these types of things. And so as a marriage progressed, I finally just had to I remember saying, now here's where we're going to get transparent, right? I remember saying and looking at him, and I said, about 5 years in, I said, "But you promised me you were going to change." And he looked at me and said, "And you believed me." It was in that moment I said, "Oh, something's got to give." Some other things had come. Some other things had just unfolded that I remember. Now here's the pivot. Also the pivot. I sat in my apartment, and I sat in my chair, like a chair like this. I spun around, and the Holy Spirit said, "Where have you been?" And it was like this gray, just blanket of smoke, just like lifted off of me. And it said, "Wake up." And I was like, "Wake up." And that was really the pivot. And when he said, "And you believed me," Holy Spirit said, "It's time to disconnect." So I had to start work. That's when I started working on myself. Like, I'm in something that I don't even know what I'm in. And I'm just going to call it out. It was psychological, verbal, emotional abuse. And that's one of the things in the church that we have been afraid to call out because of people's position in the church. It is what it is. And so finally, after all these things, other things just came within the marriage. And I was at the point, I was like, I didn't want to be bothered with him or anybody else. He used to tell me, well, I'm just going to take care of you until you divorce me. I said, bruh, you can wait for a long time because I ain't in a place to be with nobody or you. And he eventually divorced me. And so most people who know our story in the church thought that I divorced him, but he divorced me, which he did me a favor in releasing me because he knew he couldn't uphold what he promised to do.
I was jolted a little bit when you said musician because my ex-husband was a musician. He was a drummer. And so one of the things that and not particularly in that relationship, but in another relationship that I had, another thing that you called it psychological verbal abuse
and emotional
abuse. Another thing that I would possibly add is spiritual manipulation. Because I was with someone at one time who spiritually manipulated using the voice of God and saying that, but I know you're my wife because the Lord told me you were. And I was like, well, funny thing about God is he's most of the time, if not all of the time, going to confirm his word, especially if it's about somebody else. I said, and he's never told me that. I said, I ain't saying that you ain't hear it. I'm just saying he ain't said it to me. And I was talking to, after I ended that relationship, I was talking to another lady. We went out to lunch and she's a white lady. And she said to me, I can't stand when men spiritually manipulate women by use of God. She was like, it just burns me up. And I think about that often happening in the church.
Yes.
And we have to be very careful. I remember hearing Jackie Hill Perry say this one time. She said, whenever she hears people from the pulpit or anywhere else say, God said, you have to be ready to back that up with spiritual text. Right? Because it has to be validated in some way, some form. It has to be validated. And I don't think people really understand, but when they get people who, like, I don't know where you were in your faith at 31 years old, but a lot of people at 31 years old are not strengthened in their faith quite yet. They're still in this matriculation pattern of trying to learn God. So they're very easily manipulated from someone who's in church, who's been in church, who's at church all the time. And they hear these words from someone where it says, well, God told me. And when you're talking to somebody who's young in the faith and is eager to hear what God is saying, they're going to take what you said and be like, oh, God said this? Oh, wow. Not realizing, God is also going to say it to you. So I just thought that was, so let me ask you this. So marriage, divorce. So you got married when you were 31 years old. You got divorced when you were?
Around 40, 41.
Okay. So at any point in there, did you all discuss having children?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Where did that go? Did you feel like that wasn't something that was ever going to happen?
Yeah. At one point, I got pregnant. I had a miscarriage.
Okay.
And so here's where I'm going to be real transparent with you. I don't know if your podcast folks are ready for especially the folks that know me.
Let's be ready.
Right. Especially the folks that know me. I had a termination during my pregnant while I was married. I decided I cannot have children with him. But I also was in a place I was traumatized because when I told him I was pregnant, he said to me, is it mine? is it yours?
Mm-hmm.
I was like, what? He left and never showed up for 4 days. Abandonment, right? And so I was in a place of like, what am I going to do? I was hopeless. And so when I think about it, people, was I suicidal? No, but I definitely was homicidal.
Bro.
You hear what I'm saying?
Yes.
I remember we got into a situation and it was a part of me that he could bring up the anger, but it was so he could call me crazy, right? Can you relate with that?
And it's so called, it's like gaslighting or something.
Gaslight, projection and gaslighting and all of that.
Gaslighting. Yeah.
And so he says, are you just crazy? You crazy? I said, oh, hey, long as you know, this is what you have the potential to bring up.
Right.
I remember grabbing a lead base and I played softball. So I know, and I played shortstop. So I know how to scoop a softball and toss it over to first base like nothing, right?
Yeah.
I heard the Holy Spirit say, you might kill him if you hit him in the head with this lead. I scooped it up and redirected it and it hit the wall. And that's when he was like, you crazy. I said, as long as you know. I left I left for 3 months.
Yeah.
And when I came back, I looked and said, if you expect me to live with somebody I'm afraid of, let me know. I said, because I saw somebody's life leaving. I don't know if it was yours or if it was mine, but I saw death flash before my eyes. And so after that, until the divorce, it was like, thank God I did not have any children under this marriage.
Listen, so once again, something else that we have in common. Like I literally just had this episode, had this discussion in this episode. One of my episodes, we often ask God, why doesn't something happen? Right? Well, why can't we do this? Why can't we have this? Why am I not able to do this? In my situation, I was never able to get pregnant. So even though I may have wanted to get pregnant, I just couldn't get pregnant, right? But what we understood out of that was God always knows the ending of a thing when we only know the beginning or what we see, right? And so God is like, you don't understand why I don't allow this to happen or why this cannot go forward because you don't know what the end of this is going to look like, right? Because number one, this was never really a part of my plan for you. But as we know, God has allowances.
Yes.
He will allow certain things because our life is a journey of development. And so he, in that podcast, we talked about how we have to be intentional of knowing that God knows this is not supposed to be a part of your life. And when we look at your situation of what you just described, it's literally the same thing. Like now you're so glad that God blocked the ability of seeing something through. Like people can judge whatever they want to judge.
They can judge whatever they
can
want.
Judge whatever. They can say whatever. Oh, she did this. Oh, she. Listen, at the end of the day, you don't know why God allowed that thought to come into your mind, you to do what you did, because God knows. I just got done having a conversation with somebody where I said, God is a savage God. Like you can't never say what God ain't going to do or what he won't allow somebody to do or what he will allow someone to do in order to get his will done. Right. And so I think that is kind of a takeaway. So before we go into the next piece, as a professional woman at the age that you are now, has not being a mother affected your success in any way? Or has it affected you in any way as a woman? Just as a woman?
Yeah. I definitely have those moments where I'm like, as I get older, like, oh, I don't have any children. Like, who's going to help me? Right? Who's going to, I'm going to be in this house found alone, dead. Those kinds of real thoughts.
Who's going to take care of me when I get older?
That part.
Right, who's going to bury me? Who's going to make sure I have a really good funeral?
All of that.
Because I'm going to outlive my mama, probably.
I hope so.
Right. So it's like, who gonna be there? I've had those same thoughts. Yeah.
But thank God my mother had 2 boys. I'm really close to my brothers. I'm really close to my sisters and my father's child. But definitely my brothers are like my children, right? And they see me as that sister mom kind of relationship. And I tell my mother all the time, I'm joking when I say it, but I'm serious. I'm like, girl, I'm so glad you had these 2 kids for us. One can take care of you and one can take care of me.
Right.
Now I'm gonna take this one. Right. You can have that one.
Right. You had this for us.
You had this for us.
Right.
But I'm not one of those women that I felt like God abandoned me when he didn't allow me to have children. Okay. Like I just wasn't, children was not like at the forefront of my mind to be like, oh, I want to have children. I gotta have children to be a mother. It makes me feel like a woman. That was never me.
Yeah. Okay. That's good to know. Mm-hmm. That's good to know. All right. So why a focus on mental health? I know you talked a little bit about you went into mental health, you got your degree in mental health and all of that. But my reasoning for this question is kind of twofold because you are a Black woman. Mm-hmm. And you're a Black woman in a professional space. And we know how mental health, the imbalance of such or the trauma of such can affect Black women on a much higher scale, percentage-wise, when we think about the different things that we are, accustomed to. Mm-hmm. Why a focus on mental health? Was it something that you personally went through? Was it something that kind of allowed you to go in that direction or what?
Sure. So I've always been in the field of public health. Mm-hmm. And so in public health, we're looking at the bigger picture of well-being in communities and families and individuals. And so we always looked at coping skills, stress. When I came to Chicago, I worked at the University of Illinois at Chicago on a violence prevention project. It was research. And so I worked with youth doing a social emotional learning development curriculum, where we're teaching decision-making, coping skills, working with families, also led a group called Strengthening Families. And so I work with parents on how to work with their teens. And so that's where my initial love for just health and wellness came from. But as I began to work in Chicago communities and schools and some of the roughest neighborhoods in Chicago, trying to reduce the risk of violence in young people, that's where my love and passion again came for just trying to understand what's going on in families and community. But it also did something for me, to try to help understand where I came from and my origin of family. But when I got into Chicago and I started getting into the church and started seeing all of these other things and my own experience with my marriage, and I just was like, something's missing. I always knew I was called to ministry. And so when I asked the Lord, I'm like, okay, when I go back to school, and then it was all the other thing was too, is looking where I was developing as a professional, what am I going to do? And so I was thinking about going to get another doctorate. And then it was like, the Lord was like, no, do something else in this mental. I didn't want to get a doctor of public health. I was like, I really want to do that. Mm-hmm. So look at this. And I was like, well, if I'm in ministry, why would I go back and get another master's? Right. And maybe I should do ministry work. And he was like, you can learn the Bible and read the Bible and get teaching and all this kind of stuff. You can learn that on your own. I need you to understand human development and bring that into the church setting. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay. But where I was in my profession, I knew I needed to take a different path. But also where I was in my life, I was married and trying to figure out, excuse me, can I cuss on? What the heck? I want to say, what the hell is going on?
Right. Right.
And so that was the other reason that I was trying to figure out some things. And then at that point is when I began to do therapy myself. Yeah. And so I've always been, again, natural leader and a helper of others. And so as I began to just, again, see young Black children, right, they would say things to me like, oh, you talk white. And I'm like, what? But what they heard was someone who spoke correct grammar. That was different from them. Mm-hmm. That was culture that I had to learn, wait a minute, what's going on here? And so really trying to encourage and help young people. That's kind of where my love again and through developed for mental health.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, I have my own stories with the, oh, you talk white.
Yeah.
And so I went to elementary school predominantly white. Like I was the only black, like so much so I was the only black person in the school picture for my class, like every year.
Yeah.
And every now and then there would be another poor black soul whose mama made them come to the school. And so it was me and them, but for the most part, for 6 years, from kindergarten through 7 years. So from kindergarten to 6th grade, and then pre-K and all that, we lived on the beach side, and the beach side was considered, white. And so I went to a preschool that was predominantly white. And so I told my mom, I said, "You're the reason why there was like this taboo for me going to HBCUs." I was nervous. I was scared. She went to one. She went to Bethune-Cookman College, but I didn't go to one. And it was almost like I was borderline. All right, healthy women, don't y'all judge me for what I'm about to say now. But I was afraid of other black people because I had not been around them. Right. And where my mother was trying to protect me and trying to give me a really good education, kind of hindered me a little bit from the natural progression of my development. And so when it was time for me to go to high school, like I went to the predominantly white elementary school, and I begged my mother if I could go to a middle school in my neighborhood, because so I went to these schools, but then I lived in a predominantly black neighborhood, which was the south side of where we lived. And so she let me go, but it was a culture shock for me. Culture shock. I went to the middle school and everything was fine, but I had a really difficult time fitting in because I didn't have that. They all went to elementary school together. Yeah. They all knew each other. They all talked like one another, but I talked like I was white, right? And then that followed me up to high school, and I went 1 year to a high school in my local community, and I could not. I got into a fight. I begged my mother, please let me go to the other school, which was a combination of, it was inter-race. Yeah. And I was finally able to go there, but it was everything. I said all that to say it was such a culture shock for me. And so I understand what you were talking about in terms of like the mental health struggle and trying to develop something to help break down these cultural barriers. Because again, when it was time for me to graduate from high school, now a lot of the emphasis they put on HBCUs, we didn't have that emphasis 30 years ago, right? And then if we did, I didn't. I was like, I'm scared, because my mother, like I said, where she thought she was protecting me, I don't know how much of it I was being protected at the time. So I think that that does play a role. It plays a role in the whole mental.
It does. And I would follow up with that just to talk. I remember, so I was probably 2 or 3 in my school picture of us. But I remember being in 8th grade, and I was always the only black cheerleader. Whenever I started like cheering in 8th grade up and through I left high school. I remember I was in 8th grade. My mother said, "You do know that you're black, right?" And I was like, "Yeah." And I said, "Why would you ask me that?" I'm like, "Of course. Like, I love being black." But my mother was in segregation. And when they moved from the black school to the all white school, she was devastated. She was like, what's going on? So she was uncomfortable she's the darkest one of 9 children. Everybody else is very fair skinned. And so she had an issue with that. But there was this part of her that kind of projected a little bit onto, well, not a little bit, a lot. Parents, unless they're emotionally well, love my mother. We all love our moms, right? Great, resilient, strong woman. But she was very shocked that I felt comfortable in being in an all-white setting, but was okay with being black. Yeah. So when it was the time to go to a school, it was either the University of Kentucky, which most people went to from my school, because our mascot was a cat, wildcat, like the cats, or the University of Louisville, which spoke more to black Black students, right?
Okay.
It was more welcoming. And then Lexington, Kentucky versus Louisville, Kentucky, like you knew it was more Black people in Louisville.
Okay.
So for me, I was like, I cannot go to Kentucky. I had enough of living around and being in the setting with white people.
Okay.
So I needed to expand my view, my worldview of Black people.
You know what?
I needed to immerse myself.
Yeah. And it would have been, so that's interesting, because I think if I would have even been introduced to that perspective, so I mean, you know what? Another thing that I think that also played a role in it is I'm an only child biologically. And so it's always been me. And I think that, so I had a very tight connection with a high school best friend and another high school best friend. So it's always like the three of us. And there was just, I can't really put my finger on it, but there was something about it that was keeping me from feeling the need or even wanting to have that immersion effect of what you just described. Whereas now, as I'm 50 years old, I'm like, dang, I wish I would have had that experience, right? Just so I could have been able to develop the relationships. And you hear about these long-term friendships and these lifelong, friendships that you develop from college of very strong Black women, and that, you kind of missed out on because of for whatever reason, like culturally or mentally or whatever. I say the one of the things that I pulled from being in that type of an immersion where it was mostly white was I'm able to kind of gel in with anybody.
Yeah.
Like I can hold a conversation with anybody. I can go hang out with anybody. I can, where a lot of other people can't.
They cannot.
They have a hard time finding their space with the opposite, another color.
Yep.
So I think, there's just like kind of finding like what benefits you the most. But I do, now that we talk about it, I do believe that might have been a little contribution to my issues. So I want to talk though about like the cultural divide between like healing and therapeutic work. I want to know what you see. Like, do you see, why is it that we are so averse to therapy?
Another loaded question.
Now that's loaded. That's very loaded.
When I think about that, I think culturally for the Black family, the Black community, it's one of those where we're some resilient people, right? The historical context of like slavery and just racism and all of these things that have caused us to have to be very strong and resilient, right? The whole thing around like what goes on in this family stays in this family, Big Mama, Mama and them saying no, you don't take that outside. We got God, we got Jesus. Like what do you need therapy for? Why are you telling people your problems?
Yeah.
And then I think it also kind of goes back to what you said earlier around seeking therapy. Like, what are they going to do for you?
Yeah.
Right. I think it's just also like the anxiety, the fear, or the unknown of like, what's going to happen in the therapy setting, right?
Yeah.
I get this all the time when most of my clients are mostly Black women, professional Black women, either at mid-level professional or like higher level professionals. And so most of the time they come in and saying, I just didn't want anybody to think I was crazy. And I have to spend time like validating, saying to them, I understand that, right? Like, I can see where you would say that, but let's break this down. Like, what does it mean to be crazy?
Yeah.
And by the time I break it down and process it with them, then they're like, oh, well, then I'm not crazy, right? So I think all of these things of why we're just adverse to therapy and the knowledge, not even just knowing, right?
Yeah.
Like what a therapist can do. And so I'll start there and stop there.
I think that's a big thing. Education.
Yeah.
Like education so I always say when people don't understand something, they just don't do anything. Right. And there's been such a stigma attached to therapy for a very long time, even prior to it now being a very acceptable mode of getting help and assistance, there's always been this stigma to therapy. Even if we look back, like as far back in early 70s, 80s, 70s, whatever, you just don't talk to people, kind of what you said. There's this relational trust factor that has to be in play. That's why we put a lot of emphasis on, well, is there a Black therapist? Can you put me in touch with a Black male therapist? Can you put me in touch with a Black female therapist? Because for Black women, there's some type of a relational connection there that at least gives us that bit of comfort.
Yes.
In hoping that sister gonna hear me.
Yeah.
Right? She gonna at least know where I'm coming from. We go into it hoping like that. And so I think that there's like that relational trust. But then, as I mentioned earlier, when there's a lack of education, people don't move. And so do you feel like there needs to be more of more education released, more educational forums, more educational, like open forums, open mental health forums that talk about, and then another thing is when people hear mental, because you remember, growing up, you're like, oh, he mental. Yeah. And when you think of somebody being mental, you think they crazy.
Right.
And that's where it goes to the Black women saying to you, I just don't want nobody thinking I'm crazy.
Yeah.
Right. So what do you think in terms of like getting beyond that, or how do we make it? And I think in the defense of everything, I think we're getting better.
Yes.
We're getting more help.
Yep.
But it's obviously not where it needs to be.
Yeah.
So what do you think? I don't know, from your expertise, how do you think it can get better?
When you just talked, the thing that came to me was more safe spaces. Where whether it's a forum, whether it's a podcast, whether it's sitting in the living room, with mom, dad, cousin, auntie, them, it has to just be a safe space. My mother will say things like, oh, Keisha, people talk to you. People don't want to talk to me. I said, Mom, you got to learn how to be a safe place.
Yeah.
I read a book by Cloud. I can't remember his last name. Wrote the book on boundaries, but he also has a book called Safe People. And so when we become safe people, people will learn to open up and talk.
Yeah.
Right. And so it is about the education, but less education in a less formal way.
Yeah.
Right. Like people don't want to hear me come in and talk about my degrees and all this kind of stuff. People don't want to hear that, those kinds of, in places they're appropriate. Right.
But when you get to the crux of everything, it's not relatable.
It's not relatable. Right. So they want to know, like, what have you gone through?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so when we're in these safe places, right? Do people want to turn, we think about the therapy chair when we're talking about mental health, right? Do people want to turn their chair to talk to you? Like they don't even want to like turn their chair to talk to you because you're not even safe, right? There's judgment there, there's condemnation, all these things. I held on to a lot of things because I didn't want to be judged, right? And so when we can have these zones where there's no judgment, then we can have these conversations, right?
Yeah.
And then you can begin to educate people. I used to tell one of my cousins, and she love her to death. He's like, girl, if you don't get a therapist, 5 years, and we still have conversations, but I'm educating her in the conversations, right? And she will say, Keisha, she's like, oh, we just need to do something like on Facebook or on something like these kinds of things. Thank God for social media, right?
Yeah.
When it's used appropriately.
When it's used responsibly and appropriately, it's a healing tool.
It's a healing tool, right? So these are things I do believe that, giving people information, I used to be, they'll tell you as a mental health therapist, like, don't do therapy with your family members or your closest friends, right? You want them to be able to come into that space and share openly and not feel like they're judged. But I would be remiss if I didn't have if I had the opportunity to be talking to my mother or a cousin or another family member, if I didn't give them my tools.
Yeah.
Right. If I didn't give them my tools, if I didn't give them my knowledge, so they can take it and run with it. Why am I keeping it to myself?
Yeah.
Right. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, but so let me ask, not but.
Right. I understand.
Not but, yeah. So do you find you're a therapist? Do you find there being sometimes a pushback from people who know you as Kesha Hammond or Kesha Hammond, the therapist? Is there ever a pushback from the people? Like when you said you would be remiss if you were having conversations with your family and giving tools, is your family open? Have you found that they are open to saying, okay, this is Kesha, somebody we can trust. We know that what she tells us we can actually apply and use and be good and move in a direction of healing? Because I feel sometimes there's also this, we talked about relational trust, and we know for a fact, hands down, one of the reasons people don't talk is what you said. People don't want to be judged. They don't know who they can trust. They feel like if they put their stuff out there, somebody's going to use it against them. And so you do have to go through this whole mechanism of like trying to figure out who you can trust with what you need to talk about. Do you find with the people that you're close to that they actually see you as who you are in the professional space and they will take that from you and use those tools?
Some of them.
Okay.
Not all of them. Because some people in our life just don't want to be accountable. They don't want to change.
And so, Kesha, I'm so glad you use this. And I really want your genuine opinion on this. I hear the word judgment a lot from a lot of people all the time. Don't judge me, da, da, da. But sometimes I feel like they get judgment and accountability confused.
Yes. Okay.
I was just wondering.
Yeah.
I was like, is it just me or what? Because I hear and I see stuff a lot and I'm like, nobody's judging you. They're actually holding you accountable for something that you might have even said you didn't want to do, or something that you know you shouldn't be doing, or something that you know you should be doing.
That part. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah.
There is a difference. And so what I try to do in my wellness journey, right, is to try to be an example, right?
Yeah.
Is to try to live out, I ain't perfect, but try to live out my wellness, right?
Yeah.
In front of people, right? Yeah. So that they know, and to be open when they do begin to have conversations. I try not to ask a lot of questions when people begin to talk, just to let people know you can talk here, right? Yeah. I can listen to you. But yeah, I believe that I do know that there are people who just don't want to be accountable and don't want to change.
And I think that that's important for us to say here. And the reason why I keep I keep pressing on this is because I want the listeners to hear and see themselves where it's appropriate, and to know that sometimes it's not about finding the right therapist. Sometimes it's not even about the therapist themselves. You have to be willing to be held accountable if you want to navigate through this journey.
Yes.
Right. Because at some point, like, what good is it to even find the perfect therapist? To sit down and have a conversation with the therapist, if when the therapist gives you the tools and the resources that they know will help you to get you through this season that you're in so that you can become better for whatever, and you are like get a pushback, you're not allowing yourself to be accountable.
Yep.
Or to be held accountable for where you need to go. And I think that that's a brash reality that some people need to come to grips with.
Yeah. I tell my clients when they come, I tell them, I'm like, I'm the therapist that's going to be compassionate, have empathy, validate your feelings, but I'm going to gently stretch you, right? Until we build relationship.
Yeah.
Research shows that it's not all the therapy tools, it's not all the modalities that we have in therapy. The real change agent is the relationship, right?
Yep.
And so when I build a relationship with them, you can come, I have a client to be like, one weekend, you can say, oh, I'm not friends with my coworker anymore. But last week you was telling me she's the best coworker. She supports me. And then all of a sudden the relationship is gone. Right.
Yeah.
And so if I was not willing to stretch and grow and develop, that's what life is about. We're growing and developing. Yeah. Right. And so if you want to stay stagnant, then stay stagnant. But how can we grow and heal and stretch in this particular situation?
Right.
And so those are my clients who really want to do the work to change and be accountable. Yeah. But I have some that, they don't want to change, or it'll take them a long time to change.
Yeah.
And I'm there with them, right? Yeah. 3, 4, 5, 6 years. And we're like, when the mass finally comes down, I'm like, there we have it.
Yeah.
You're ready. Right. So
kind of when you get to a point of where you're just, as Fannie Lou Hamer said, when you get tired, sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? Like that's a real thing.
Yep.
When you're tired of being on the hamster wheel, when you're tired of being the victim, victimizing yourself, right? When you're tired, like no one is downplaying everything you've gone through. No one's doing that.
Yep.
But at some point, we got to get to this place of I'm ready to be done. Yeah. Right. So I thought that was a really good place to be for a minute, because I think that there is it's truth behind. From a cultural standpoint, we're a little hesitant about therapy because sometimes therapy has not always been kind to us. But then I also think that therapy is what therapy is going to be. You have to bring a willing soul to therapy to heal your soul. Yeah. And sometimes we're right there in the middle of that. And we need somebody to tell us to get it together. Right. All right. So, you touched a little bit on church, and therapy, and that's a whole episode by itself. So we don't have to like go deep into that, but how much of somebody gonna get me for this. How much of a role do you think modern day church experiences play in people's mental instabilities or their health or their needing to have therapy? I know that question's kind of weird. What's the role of church in therapy? From your experience.
The role of church in therapy. So, this is the time where I like to just touch base with Pete Scazzaro,
right,
where he talks about emotionality and spirituality are parallel, right? The church, do they have a role to fix our generational, thing? No, but the spirituality, emotion, they go together, right? So while we look at spirituality as how much you come to church, how much you read your Bible, how much you go to prayer, or all these kinds of doing things. And oftentimes it's from the outside in rather than the outside in rather than inside out, right? And so one of the things I think when you had pitched this before is that, does this church contribute to like our mental health or our trauma or those types of things? I do believe that conception, being born, right, it makes us have to go to therapy, right? This was sooner, and that we can not separate physical health from mental health and understand that it's a merging of two, right? That they have to go together. So with the church thing is that people are coming there unhealthy. We all are there unhealthy, right? And so I think the role of the church has to be, again, education, right? Knowing the difference, right, between someone's emotions, trauma, mental health conditions, than it not just being a spiritual church thing, right? And so when we talk about that, it reminds me that I remember telling my mother, got a lot of mama stories, right? Telling my mom, there was a gentleman at their church they were trying to help who was on substances, drugs. And so she's like, I just think he's saved. I know he's this. He prays. He comes to church. He does this. And I said, well, Mama, maybe it's not the spiritual part of him that's sick. And she was like, well, what do you mean? And I was like, maybe it's the emotional, mental part of him that's not well, right? That we need to look at the comprehensive picture of people. So I don't know if that's the answer to your question, but
no, I think it is. Yeah. And I think, and so I'll tell you why I asked that question. I asked that question because through social media and just through other conversations, I've looked and listened to how people respond to certain posts about spiritual something that has to do with church or something that was preached or something that was said. And I look at the responses to what a lot of people are like saying to these particular posts or these spiritual messages. And some of the commonalities that I find is, as you mentioned, people are coming into church sick. They're sick. They're emotionally unhealthy. They're mentally unhealthy. They're psychologically unhealthy. And then we have people who we are trusting with our spiritual development, who God has put in place. Maybe. We don't know if God put them in place or not. But they're in place, right? And trusted by God with a higher standard. Or to a higher standard of making sure that our development is at least founded on some basic principles so that these people who are sick can get well. If you are in spirit, and we know that God is a God who cares about the totality of a person. God is not just concerned about the spiritual side of a person. He's concerned about the totality of a person because we are spiritual beings with bodies, right? So there's a reason why he gave us a body. And with our body, we have these mental and emotional effects. But when you don't have people in the church who are learned on that or knowledgeable about that, or who themselves haven't taken the role of getting themselves their own assistance from a mental or emotional health standpoint, you're regurgitating information, you're bleeding your issues on the people that you are responsible for, and it's making the people in your church sicker. Right? Yeah. And so that's kind of where I was coming from, because I've just seen and heard conversations, and I listen to how people respond on social media, and it breaks my heart because these people are hungry. And we have a responsibility by God to prepare these people for a greater work. And not that the church is responsible for therapy. They're not responsible for therapy, but you hold a responsibility to some degree to put them in a space where they can attempt to get better, where they can be knowledgeable, be coherent enough to be able to, but because we are spiritual beings with a physical body, what's going to be affected first, right? Our mental, our emotional, our soul is going to be affected. And so I think that's why it's a loaded question. I know it is. And I just wanted to kind of see like where you were coming from with that, or what you thought about it. I don't know how we can fix that. I don't know if it's something that there's more education that's needed. But the thing about that is people are only going to learn from what they allow themselves to be taught.
Yeah. No one's exempt, right? From the pulpit to the pew.
Yeah.
Everybody has a wellness journey that they have to take to be well and to be whole. And you're right. So for me in the church culture that I came from, it was that the therapy, like what are we doing that for? And it was a culture that could make people sicker, that was making people sicker. And so I knew that I had to find something different, right? And go somewhere differently. And even still, there's no perfect church, like there's no perfect family and all that, but how healthy is it?
Yeah, that's the question. Oh my God, that is a really good question. How healthy is it? And how aware are we of the level of our healthiness? And are we even open to, because a church is an edifice, right? Like the physical part of it is an edifice. It's where we gather to do whatever. The church itself are the people. Right. And so if you have a teaching mechanism that is locked in the old way of doing certain things, where you're not made aware of where you are in your spiritual journey, or where you are in your mental journey, or where you are in your emotional journey, and you're locked in this mindset of, we don't go to therapy, we go to church. Or maybe we do go to therapy and I think I'm okay, but I'm going to teach from this perspective because it's the way that I understand it, which might not translate over well for somebody else as they're trying to understand it. So it's not that the church is responsible for that per se, but because, as I mentioned before, we are soul individuals. with physical bodies. You kind of are. You're responsible for the soul of a person. You're responsible for their soul is their emotional side, their mental side, their psychological side. All that other, God is truly, he cares about that.
He cares.
That's why he made a person in that way.
Yeah.
And I think the church gets so locked into just, is your soul saved?
Right.
Is your soul saved? Yeah. Okay, the soul can be saved. And from your mother's experience and from what you were telling your mom, yeah, mom, he goes to church every day. Yeah, mom, he serves. Yeah, mom, he does this. But he's not well.
He's not well.
From another side. Can you envision that?
Can you envision
And sometimes they can't envision that.
Can't envision that.
Yeah. Right? Because it's all about just spiritual. Anyway, this has been good. And we got to get ready to go.
Oh, well, you have me back. Look, this was nice.
I'm always down for part twos. I really believe that part twos are, I don't want to leave anything on the table.
Yeah.
And so I think that if there's something that we need to extend in conversation, I'm always down for part two. So stay tuned.
Yes, okay? Will do.
The last question that I'm going to ask you, though, as we close this out, is where are you on your personal journey?
That's a great question. In therapy. In therapy.
In the Rolodex.
Listen.
On the speed dial.
That part.
Girl, you got an appointment today?
I think I heard it roaming through social media. I think it was Kerry Washington or somebody, I think one of those celebrities that said somebody asked her, like, ain't you supposed to at some point not be in therapy? She's like, no, we don't stop going to the doctor, right? I may not be in therapy for
you might not be in therapy right now, but yeah.
But at some point, like during COVID, like everybody, wants to go to, my calendar was packed with clients trying to get in.
Yeah.
And then even at some point for them, I was like, oh, something's going on being at home by myself and alone. And I was like, wait, what is this? It was just resurfacing some things.
Yeah.
But my personal wellness is, one is learning, right? I'm going to be a lifelong learner around all things health and wellness. Especially mental health. And so that's why I'm in school. And to hit on a little bit about the church is I'm in school to get my doctorate in pastoral counseling and care. So that's one of the things we got to have training, right?
Yes.
To teach pastors and ministers and stuff how to be healthy and how to have healthy church.
I didn't even know that, y'all.
Yeah.
But you see how that just kind of rolled in there really good because they need that. That's what I think leaders need. They need that.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad to hear that.
So the other part of my personal wellness is just mind, body, spirit, right? Trying to stay healthy as I can, understanding that life be lifing, but when it gets to up shifting and I got to do something to maintain, right, the balance. So I'm trying to work out, as much as I can, and it ain't even all about trying to look good. It's about I want to live longer. Right. I want to live a good, healthy life, right? I'm dating a little bit, right? Ladies, get out there and date. But don't, that's why we got to heal ourselves so that we could be healthy and be out there dating and not making somebody else pay for what somebody else did, whether it's mama, boyfriend, husband, whoever.
Yeah.
So date a little bit,
give yourself permission to live.
And just, we hear that buzzword self-care, right? But I'm in the space of just, offer myself grace, not excuses, but grace and self-compassion, being kind to myself when I do make a mistake or when I do question and doubt myself. So it's I don't know. That's just where I'm at.
I love
my wellness, my wellness journey.
I think I love your answer. Like your wellness is a journey.
Yeah,
it's your journey is on wellness, right? And so, that's what I want. That's like the one thing that I want to focus on with the platform is just helping women to really be aware of their wellness from a holistic standpoint. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, we're here to fulfill God's purpose.
That's it.
But we will not be able to fulfill that purpose effectively if we are scattered, if we are all over the place, if our wellness is a hot mess, if we can't be in tune with what's going on, if we're not giving ourselves grace without excuses, if we don't know the difference between giving yourself grace and excuses.
Yes.
I love that, right? Because some people I've done that a few times. I'm giving myself grace. Actually, no, you're giving yourself an excuse. Girl, get up, right? So like really understanding what the definition of that is and how does that look for you. So I love the fact that you're a therapist who's in therapy.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's a relatable factor that people need to understand. Like therapists are not just out here trying to get all up in your business. No. They actually have somebody that gets in their business, right? To help them. We're all on
accountable
journey, this accountability journey. We're going from glory to glory, as the Bible says. We're evolving, we're becoming, we are doing what God called us to do. And I think one of the most important lessons that we can get out of this episode today is that we are a spirit man with a body, a physical body, and God is concerned about it all. And so if you are not concerned about your physical self, right, and everything that is inclusive of that, then you're not giving God the glory that he created you to do, right? Mental health, focus, and making sure that you're living in a balanced state of life is extremely important for you to be able to honor and glorify God. Because that's why he gave, once we get to heaven, we got this body no more, forget about it. Forget about it. Right. But right now, while we're on earth and he gave us all these different elements, we need to really give attention to it. And that's what this is about. Yeah. So I appreciate you for being here. Very good. Thank you so much for being transparent. And I'll have you back soon. I love you, my sister.
I love you more.
And you all, thank you so much for being here with me on this episode 4 of the Healthy Woman Podcast. It's your girl, Dr. Makeba, your host. Remember, make sure that you share this episode out with at least one girlfriend, maybe 2. I don't care. It's your business. But make sure you share us out there so that we can double our impact with just the click of a share button. And until next time, I will see you then. Always be encouraged. And remember, I love you. Peace.